'79, I was in my early 20s. There was a lot of grassroots activity here in Portland. A lot of it was against nuclear power and nuclear weapons. There was a real climate on that. And more of us were learning what was happening in Central America. At that time, primarily Nicaragua, and we were really horrified by the brutal repression of the Somoza regime, the U.S. policies that supported it, and other repressive governments. And we were also excited and hopeful about the movements. At that time, the focus was primarily on the Sandinista movement and what they were trying to do. So in 1979, in the spring, a local organizer named Sue Rumney had a film showing at Portland Community College, and it was Nicaragua, Free Homeland or Death. We saw that as an opportunity. After the film showing, we connected and said, we want to get together and work on this issue. And then the Portland, Nicaragua Support Committee was born. And that was the first organization. And we had a brochure. We started meeting at a church. I don't think it's a church anymore, Centenary Wilbur Church in Southeast Portland, where a lot of progressive activity was happening. We joined the National Nicaragua Network. We started bringing speakers. We formed the first Speakers Bureau. We compiled the first phone tree. Our initial focus was pressuring the Carter administration, remember them, to stop supporting Somoza. Over the next few years, we expanded our work to El Salvador and Guatemala, changed our name to PCASC, affiliated with CSPIS and the Guatemala Network, and with groups that were forming around the state doing similar work. And the areas of work that we were doing then, this will sound pretty familiar, there were basically three of them. One was outreach and education about what was happening, the U.S. role, progress of the Nicaraguan revolution. I remember a lot of excitement, particularly around the literacy campaign and what was happening there. We did a lot of work with congregations, classes, unions, community groups, and so on. And we did media outreach, which was very different back then because we didn't have all this media, we didn't have social media. We focused relationships, with the Oregonian. We got Kink Radio to come to Nicaragua as part of the delegation. It was a much smaller pool that we were working with. And we worked to mobilize people to prevent the U.S. from invading, intervening, and to support movements for social change. We had relationships with the congressional offices. We were always trying to get them information. We had rallies. Some of them were quite large, vigils, letter writing campaigns, and so on. Our outreach expanded that initial phone tree till we had the Pledge of Allegiance. No, the Pledge of Resistance. Every PCASC. Stretch that. Pledge of Resistance in '84, where there were 80,000 people nationally signed up. If the U.S. does this, we'll do that. If they do this, we'll do that. We'll come to a rally. We'll do civil disobedience. It was very massive. Another thing that was different then was, obviously, that's where I feel like old. We didn't have the internet. We didn't do texting. We did a lot of work with telephones and file cards and notebooks. And back then, people answered their phones. We had, I remember having a notebook with about 25 close contacts, and I would get in touch with people regularly, talk about what we were doing, have a conversation about what they might be interested in, brainstorming. We'll say, well, my church social concerns committee might be interested in this. So we were able to have those kinds of interactions. I don't think people were inundated in the same way with these things. So Congress was always getting ready to renew funding for the Salvadoran military. These things came over and over again. And we worked to make the case that horrific violations of human rights by U.S. proxies were routine, and the U.S. needed to be out of the region. With groups like ours throughout the country, we made what were supposed to be invisible wars visible. There was a deep fear of another Vietnam, and Vietnam wasn't that long ago back then. And in fact, CSPIS had a phrase they were using then, El Salvador Spanish for Vietnam. So we were raising this awareness, mobilizing so many people so our government could not send troops, but There were other things they did. They supported proxies, and they used elaborate schemes. Remember the Iran-Contra scandal to fund them. So it was complicated. One thing that we did that was an effort I wanted to mention was in 1982, we did a ballot measure where Multnomah County called on the federal government to cease the aid to El Salvador. And it was a victory of 3-1. And we mobilized, educated a lot of people in the county. And going back to how things were in the days, we didn't have paid petitioners. It was all volunteers doing that, and they wouldn't put it on the ballot, so we had a court case. But we reached a lot of folks, and the idea here was that local governments should speak up when the federal government isn't representing us. And at that same year, there was another measure statewide for nuclear free, so this was in the air, so to speak. And I guess the other area of our work, all of these will seem very familiar, was direct connection with people in Central America. Some of that was material aid, everything from just like basic stuff like Nicaraguan earthquake relief, medical aid to El Salvador, supporting communities in the FMLN controlled areas of Nicaragua with aid. And really, once we had the Portland Carrillo Sister City Association, where we had the sister city of Nicaragua for many years, there was a lot of aid, major aid to the hospital there. And there were sister health clinics, sister schools, sister churches, sister unions, a variety of partnerships that came together, people to people. And of course, so many people went to Central America, particularly Nicaragua, and so many delegations. And we brought delegations here as well, especially from Corinto, to help build those bonds. So the three things I remember just in terms of my sense of that time was one, the sense of urgency. Two, and this is something about that era, there was a real sense of hopefulness. We have the chance. You know, Nicaragua has won, El Salvador is winning, Guatemala will win. There was that sense at that time. And I guess the last thing that comes to mind was the sense of community. We had, just like we do today, the sense of community within PCASC, and also other organizations and efforts that had come together around these issues in the community we had overall. So that's a glimpse of the past, and it's really impressive to me that the work continues. The conditions may change, the strategies may change, but I feel very proud and grateful to be part of this. So that's a few memories.
Thank you, Diane.
I think I better use this. I can't hear very well, so it's sometimes hard to know how loud I'm talking. I spent the early years of the 1980s and into the mid-years either as a volunteer or as a staff person in the office on 37th and Hawthorne. And Diane has given a great overview of the kinds of things that we did in the 80s. And what I have to say will overlap a little bit, but what I want to talk about is how is it that PCASC was able to succeed and survive and then become the beautiful thing that you all continue to make it. I think the first line of contact for many people were the kind of high visibility campaigns like the ballot measure, like the Pledge of Allegiance. Sorry. Pledge of Resistance. And those things drew in a lot of new supporters who were motivated. Some of them were politically experienced, others not at all, may not have known much at all about Central America. And so part of the task that we set ourselves was to educate this constituency, which was increasingly joining us. And one thing that, I don't know if Diane mentioned, but Ben Linder from our own community here in Portland was an engineer in Nicaragua helping to build small-scale hydro plants and was assassinated by the Contra along with 2 of his Nicaraguan colleagues who were supporting him. And that event brought just hundreds and hundreds of people to our door on Hawthorne. I mean, people were leaving bags of food, and the phone was ringing off the hook. So these were moments when lots of people were really interested and concerned about the region. It had really come home to them that someone whose family they may have known had been affected in this way. And then the Linder family, of course, spoke all over the country about what had happened and raised, something like $250,000 for the projects that Ben had been working on. So we had a lot of outreach projects designed to reach people in various ways, many of which I'm sure you are still making use of. We had educational events, some of them were cultural, some were more analytical, speakers who had some expertise. We distributed a slideshow. We created it based on slides from people who had been to Nicaragua, and distributed it through churches, schools, house meetings. We had house meeting campaigns where people would invite a few friends. We had speakers bureaus, Spanish classes where we would teach Spanish and talk politics in the language. We had a monthly newsletter. So we did all these things to educate people, to give them a sort of political education in what was happening in the region. But we also looked at our internal education and our own understandings. And many of us, we were at all different levels of exposure to the issues. We trained speakers to go out to house meetings and help them practice. How would you answer this question? What are some responses you could give? Many people then returned to their own institutions like churches and schools to organize their own Central America groups or organizations who would then work autonomously. We turned our, what originally was kind of a newsy newsletter, like something I as staff person would sort of late at night, skim through news articles and try and write, what was happening in each country. And we turned it into an analytical, monthly, really thoughtful journal, really. And I know some people here, Patsy was involved in it. I think Norm was involved at some point. I probably miss other people who wrote things for it. At a certain point, I left, I moved to Nicaragua, and some of these things I'm speaking about because I received copies of the journal, but I was no longer directly involved in producing it. And there were a lot of political discussions and meetings, people like Tim and other people who are around at the time will remember some of the debates, because we had a spectrum of views about social change, and were we seeking reforms? Was our goal limited to just ending the humanitarian crisis? Were we looking to support revolutions? Did we want to support some kind of social transformation in our own country? And how were all those things going to happen? And so I think it was really important that we had those debates, and we didn't always agree, obviously. So that was a productive form of education for each of us. PCASC was a kind of strategic node in a larger field of organizations concerned with Latin America and Central America. So there were teachers' committees, there were health worker committees. I know Peggy was involved in CRICA, right? Wasn't that one of them? And the Lawyers Committee on Central America, the Labor Committee, the Sister City Association that Diane mentioned. Each of the colleges and universities had their own groups. And I think the sort of model of PCASC as a sort of recognized activist oriented organization but having relationships with all these autonomous groups that had their own strategies and approaches and came together around big projects like the ballot measure, for example. But then, they had ownership of their own work. It wasn't like we told them what to do at all. It was very much of a set of autonomous relationships. So in all these ways, PCASC was a community. There were personal relationships that held it together. There were political relationships. And it was a school, where all of us were in some stage of learning about politics and the issues. And we were located in this larger constellation of movements, like the Black United Front, like PECUM, the Organization of Immigrant Farm Workers. There was a South Africa support organization called POSAF, the National Lawyers Guild, their local lawyers, lefty lawyers committee, anti-nuclear and peace groups, union movements, so there was a way in which we tried to bridge these different issues and make connections that would draw them into our issue, and also in which we supported their demonstrations, their rallies, their other, like the Black United Front had a school boycott that many of us supported. If there's any way in which, looking back, I think, of course, there are lots of things we could have done better. That's an area where I think maybe we could have done a better job at forging the connections between issues. And on the other hand, we were all always overwhelmed, overworked. Our partners all complained that we were never available because we were always at the office or in a meeting. But I guess, so that's mainly what I wanted to say, and I think my larger point is really that PCASC's strength was the respectful, autonomous relationships that it constructed, both internally and externally. And as conditions in Central America have sort of taken a turn for the repressive or the regressive once again, including in Nicaragua, where many of the things, I lived there for almost 7 years, and it's been really difficult for many of us who, whether we worked here in Portland or had experiences in Nicaragua, to see what's happening right now. And so more than ever, I think we need the kind of communities that we had then and which we have now. I mean, it se siente, you can feel it in the room. So community is really a crucial aspect of activism. All right, thank you, and thank you for inviting me.